Hey, what's up everyone? Dragon back again, here to tell you that you should be watching Mimic. So Mimic is a 1997 science fiction film written and directed by Guillermo del Toro and is based off a short story written by Donald A. Wilhine. And essentially is the story of this plague or this outbreak in New York City that is killing children. The children are the ones who are kind of contracting the disease, and they are starting to die off in record numbers. And there's a great opening to the film where the opening credits show kind of all the the reports and the news reports and the kind of the like all the coroner reports of all these dying children, and then you see like these great shots of like empty schoolyards in the winter, where it's basically places that would normally be filled with kids are no longer, because the kids are all either dead or in these huge kind of hospital wards, where they are just dying off, and the scientist is brought in to basically combat the disease, and basically ends up finding a way to fight it. And basically they learn that the carrier of this virus is cockroaches, which if you've ever been to New York City or any kind of large urban sprawl, yep, there's cockroaches. So basically she kind of creates this genetically engineered insect called the Judas breed, which essentially will secrete an enzyme or a toxin that the roaches will be drawn into, consume, and be poisoned off and die. Thereby she's essentially eradicating the roach population in New York City, thereby by eradicating the carrier of the disease. Okay, fast forward, kids are coming back, they're bouncing back, they're like, hey, everything worked. But we're starting to get these reports of these kind of mysterious deaths, these strange killings. No one really knows what to make of them. No one really knows kind of who is behind them. Just the only kind of connection they all seem to have is kind of these eerie reports of these tall, slender figures in like long trench coats that you just kind of see in the dark, and either before people are killed or at the scene of the crime. Essentially, some people are kind of eyewitness, and a lot of these stories are kind of told by a lot of the homeless people who live kind of in the subways underground. And it's kind of this thing where it's like, kind of becoming an urban legend, like this almost kind of Slender Man looking figure that is being seen. And basically looking into the issue, looking into the matter, she discovers that the insects that they released prior have now kind of, which were all supposed to die off. Essentially, these insects were not supposed to be able to live past a very short period of time. That way they themselves would not throw off the kind of insect ecology, if you will. But come to find out that not only have they not dying off, they're breeding faster. So before they can die off, they are reproducing, and they are evolving and growing, and they're discovering that these insects are essentially evolving within generations as opposed to years. And come to basically, long story short, what is killing people are in fact these insects having now grown enormous human size and have learned to mimic their natural predator, the human species. So when you essentially see this Slender Man figure, what you're actually seeing is this insect risen in a vertical stance with its wings cascade down in front of it, giving it kind of almost like a trench coat or overcoat look, and a kind of shell that goes over its actual face that kind of vaguely resembles from afar kind of like the sockets and the nose of a human. So if you see this thing from far away, kind of in very low light, mostly silhouetted, it would just look like a tall man in a trench coat. Obviously, when you get right up on it, you see that's not what it is. But it's this notion that these insects have learned to mimic us. And in an age where humanity has kind of, dominated the natural world, we've conquered the natural world. There's no predator, that can really match us. I mean, you let a, tiger loose in a suburban neighborhood, yeah, it might hurt a few people, it'd probably kill a few people even, but eventually we're going to catch it and find it, because ultimately what makes it so exotic is what gives it away. This tiger cannot blend in. You're not going to mistake it for a neighborhood cat. But what happens when nature learns to kind of
mimic us. Like, and insects are known for doing this, where they will hide in plain sight. They learn basically both to hunt and protect themselves from that which they're hunting in the same way. The way that we kind of don't notice them is the way they get close to us, and that's essentially what these creatures are doing. They are mimicking us. It is because we have tampered with them. We have given them a biological edge that they would not have, developed naturally. That they are now doing to us, what other insects would do to other creatures they both hunt and fear. And that's the interesting thing. These creatures both hunt and fear. So they recognize that we are a danger to them, and yet they also recognize that we are their best source of food. Now, I'm not going to give too much away about the ending, but I will say this. If you are familiar with the backstory of the production of this film, or actually, even if you're not, I'll say it anyway. This was Guillermo del Toro's first American film. Prior to that, he had done Kronos. He has only worked on like small Mexican productions. This is kind of his first Hollywood studio production, and quickly kind of learn, kind of about the infamous nature that, a lot of people have sometimes working with the studio system, is that when you work for a big studio, especially at this point in his career, when he was not Guillermo del Toro, when he was just, some young guy, some young filmmaker from Mexico, he did not have as much clout and control over the project. So if you're familiar with Del Toro's work, you know that he's very much an artist and that he loves monsters. And while he's not above making a good scary monster movie, he always wants to do something different with the monster. He wants to cast them not only in a sympathetic light, but use them to kind of perhaps reflect our own shortcomings. And this is very much the case for this film. But what the studio had signed on for was just a monster movie with giant killer bugs, and there was a bit of from what I understand, again, unfortunately don't know the man personally, but from what I've kind of gleaned a little bit from what he's talked about in the interviews, and there's a great commentary if you get the extended cut of the movie on Blu-ray, where he talks a little bit about it, because again, legally he can't go into too much detail, but he kind of talked a little bit about, say, how he wanted to make this film a bit more of an art piece, a bit more of a commentary on the human condition, and again, they wanted just a monster movie, which again he was happy to deliver. But with a lot of some of the greatest monster movies ever made, he wanted to add an extra dimension. He didn't want to just make it a black and white Attack of the Killer Bugs kind of movie. He wanted to kind of have an extra layer into it that made you kind of think and kind of question. And there's definitely a sprinklings of that throughout the film. You can definitely, if you kind of now know who Guillermo del Toro is from like his more recent work, like Shape of Water, Pan's Labyrinth, Crimson Peaks, you'll definitely see that in this film, but to a much lesser degree, because now Guillermo del Toro wants to make a movie about a fish guy who falls in love with a woman. He can do that, and he will win a bunch of Academy Awards for it, including Best Picture. 1997, he did not have this kind of clout, so he was very much at the mercy of the studio system, and they were not going to let this pretty much unknown director just kind of, in their minds, take what should be just a cool little popcorn, monster movie and turn it into some kind of weird artsy thing, which, had they allowed him to do that, this film, I think, might be still talked about more. But regardless of that, it is still a very well-made film. It's definitely one of my favorite creature features. It definitely has this very nice kind of urban gothic feel that Del Toro is very well known for. So the only real complaint I have about this film is that it was not allowed to be as Del Toro-esque as it could be, but the amount that it is still very satisfying. And I will tell you the ending that he intended for the film, because it's not going to spoil the ending for the film, other than that it's not the ending for the movie, but the ending of the film was supposed to be the ultimate evolution of these creatures, in which the protagonist in the film was allowed to leave and to live. And in doing so, because this creature, which now resembled much more of a human, had evolved to mimic us even further, had now surpassed humanity in that it did not choose to exact revenge against our protagonist. Rather, it allowed her to go, to live. Even though it had every reason to kill her in that moment, it chose not to, because in that moment it went from being a creature that would have been considered less than a human to a creature that had been learning to mimic humans to now a creature that has surpassed humanity. Its nature had now surpassed our humanity. It was now better than us because it was no longer subject to basal instincts of anger and rage and vengeance. It had been able to kind of overcome those basal instincts and become something better than those things, and therefore better than us. It had no longer needed to mimic human beings because it now had surpassed human beings. It was above and beyond that which it once feared and hated. So it was this great commentary of the evolution of a monster, and because it had gone beyond us, it now rendered us the monsters, because now we were the creatures that were killing out of anger and fear and territory, and this creature was no longer doing so. So it would have been a great, great ending, and it makes the ending of the film very, I hate to say it, but disappointing, because the movie does a lot of interesting things and incorporates a lot of interesting ideas, but the end of the movie is a little by the numbers, and it was essentially the end of the film that Del Toro was kind of forced to make. I mean, it's a good movie. The ending is cool. It's nice. It's a nice little action sequence, actually. So, from just a entertainment, cinematography perspective, there's nothing wrong with it. But it's once you know about what he was intending to do at the end of that, it kind of now is like, oh. But it's still a very cool monster movie. It's still has a very beautiful yet creepy vibe to it. Again, it's very much a Guillermo del Toro film. So if you are familiar with his work, you'll recognize a lot of the visual aesthetics of this film. And again, the only complaint you might have with it is that it just doesn't feel like it's enough of him. But again, that was because his hands were tied and he was fighting the studio a lot back and forth, trying to push as much as his vision into the film as he could while they were kind of pushing back against it. But, that's kind of a tale as old as time in Hollywood, unfortunately. And it's not usually till a director really kind of breaks out and, gets a few big successes under, his or her belt, where then studios are more apt to kind of just back off because they kind of look at it as well, even if we don't get it, obviously a lot of people who pay money to watch these movies do, so as long as they're paying money, whatever. It doesn't matter if we think it's weird, as long as they're paying for it. Whereas when you're an up-and-coming director, that studio's like, well, not only do we not get it, we're not sure if anybody else is going to get it, so we're gonna play it safe. But with that said, this movie does do a lot with the notion of survival and the idea of us as a civilized species being infiltrated by a predator and us not really looking for it. And that's the ultimate camouflage these creatures really have. It's not just the fact that they can kind of vaguely resemble us from afar. It's the fact that our sense of, being, alert of a predator potentially striking out of the darkness is all but gone in us. We're not afraid of creatures with sharp claws and teeth leaping out of an alley and eating us. We're more afraid of the guy who we think might have been following us for a block, who may have a gun or a knife in their pocket, so they can steal our wallet or our purse. We're afraid of ourselves. We're not afraid of predators. So it is ultimately that lack of fear of something like that striking is ultimately what serves as their ultimate camouflage, is that we're not looking for them, we're not expecting them. So as long as we can kind of walk by, and if they're in the 30 feet away and they just kind of barely resemble us in some way, we're not even paying them any mind. We're not thinking like, is that a person? Is that questionable? Should I be more focused on that? We're not thinking about that, because the last thing we're going to expect is a giant, 6-foot bug, killing us in the dark. So it is our kind of ignorance to even the possibility that something like that could happen that ultimately is what serves them most in infiltrating us. And that's kind of what this movie does put forward, and what of Guillermo's initial vision of this story was able to make it on screen. So for that alone, I highly recommend Mimic. I mean, again, we're going to be going through pretty much the whole Guillermo del Toro catalog on this show, but just because A, he's one of my favorite directors of all time, and B, he's just a very accomplished director in terms of a visual style and a unique way of telling story. And even in a film where he was not allowed to really express himself to the degree in which he wanted, what he was able to put of himself on screen was enough to really communicate a fascinating insight into the idea of being infiltrated by the enemy, that the enemy, that our greatest threat may not come from, you know, outside, but may come from within, that ultimately when predators strike, it is not from afar, it is from right behind you. And it's this kind of great spooky vibe that he does a good job of kind of casting in this film. And, you know, and again, if you're familiar with Guillermo del Toro, you're not going to be disappointed with this film. And this is the first, and this was my first Guillermo del Toro film too, and the first one I saw. And I think for a lot of people, this might have been the first one they've seen, mainly because you know, this is his first, I think, you know, American theatrical film. I think he, you know, then, you know, later on he was able to kind of Blade 2 kind of brought him up a little bit higher, got him Hellboy, and then Pan's Labyrinth obviously put him like kind of in the, you know, on the lips of basically everyone and anyone, regardless if they were into like kind of these smaller genre-based films or more mainstream fanfare. Everyone kind of knew him by them. But it's kind of cool to go back and see kind of how he worked his way up to get to where he is today, where now he essentially can do whatever he wants, and people will just kind of go with it because they're like, well, people seem to like it, so even if it's weird, well, people seem to like paying money for weird, so let's do it. So I don't know. I would very much like to see him maybe do a return to the creature feature genre, and maybe kind of make a creature feature. I'm not saying remake, mimic, but maybe do a film similar to it in a way, and kind of now have him tell this kind of story the way he ultimately would want to tell it without any kind of restriction. But yeah, and regardless, this film I do think it stands the test of time, and it's a fun little film, and it also does bring a kind of the moral quandary of tampering with nature, and it kind of brings the issues. Okay, were we wrong to, you know, influence nature at a genetic level, but at the same time, how many children were saved because of it? So it's kind of an interesting question of ethics that we're starting to see kind of crop up now as science and genetic engineering really is kind of progressing, I think, faster than anyone expected. So perhaps in a lot of ways this film is more relevant today than it was in 1997. But regardless, Mimic. Have you seen it? If so, what did you think? If not, I will leave links in the description section below where you can pick it up, check it out, give it a watch, and come back, give me some of your thoughts. Again, when it comes to Del Toro, I'm always very curious to see what people think, regardless if they are familiar with his work, or maybe this is the first time you're hearing of him, or maybe you've heard of him, but you just haven't watched any of his movies. And I was like, this is a cool little creepy, you know, popcorn flick that you can maybe watch in the dark and kind of allow yourself to get spooked a little bit, but while still having a lot of fun. I like movies like that a lot. My collection consists of a lot of those kinds of movies, so more of which we'll get to, I'm sure. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one. Peace!